Today, that is October 13th, the world marks the International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction. So what is the meaning of this particular day? What's fueling the frequency of natural disasters worldwide, including in Australia? And what can be done to better counter these callous calamities? Welcome to Issues and Insiders. Today we explore efforts to ease the risk of natural disasters, which pundits believe are being aggravated by climate change. For more on this reality, I have Professor Yoon Jin-ho at Gwangju Institute of Science and Technology live on the line. Professor Yoon, it's a pleasure.
Yes, thank you for having me.
I also have Doctor Steven Lade at the Australian National University with us as well. Dr. Lade, thank you for being with us.
Good afternoon.
Professor Yoon, let's start then with a few details perhaps about the International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction.
Yes, the International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction was started in 1989. That's after a call by the United Nations General Assembly that we need a day to promote a global culture of risk awareness and disaster reductions. And since then, it's every 13th of October that today we celebrate how people and communities around the world are reducing their exposures to disasters and raising their awareness. One thing to mention is that at the Sendai, they have a Sendai framework for disaster risk reductions. A few catchphrases is that people-oriented and action-oriented approaches to disaster risk reductions.
Right, indeed. And keeping that in mind, then, Dr. Lade, what would you say is the significance of perhaps setting aside such a day?
It's an important opportunity to remind ourselves that disasters are common and that we all need to take action to reduce the risks associated with them. It's estimated that over 70,000 people died across the world last year from disasters, and nearly 200 million were directly affected. So it's a really important issue. The theme of this year's day is fighting inequality for a resilient future. This theme is designed to draw attention to the fact that inequality is a cause and a consequence of disasters. This means that to address the cause of disasters requires addressing inequalities. And then on consequence, a worst case scenario is that more frequent disasters may push an additional 100 million people worldwide into poverty by 2030. So the International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction draws attention to the fact that individuals, communities and governments all urgently need to act to reduce inequality and thereby disaster risk.
Right. And Professor Yoon, pundits warn that natural disasters are on the rise. Do you agree with them? And if so, how do you explain this rather disturbing reality?
Yes, basically I agree that as I just mentioned, that our Earth has been warmed up and is likely to warm up in the futures. Then various types of disasters is likely to increase. Of course, we are still figuring out the exact cause and effect, but the general tendency is toward the more disasters. But the one thing to mention is that the natural disaster increasing is one thing, but the other thing is that the population itself is increasing. That means that the risk that people would face those type of disasters is also increasing. Another way to explain is that people want to live nearby coast, nearby beaches. That means that the risk to face like a high tide or the typhoon is also increasing. And I just mentioned that the disasters and inequalities are basically two sides of the same coins, meaning that each reinforce the others. So when the disaster happens, the inequality is increasing, and inequality is increasing, the impact of the disaster is likely to increase as well. So we have to consider all these type of, not only the natural issues, but also social issues to tackle the problems.
Right, it sounds like a vicious cycle right there. Dr. Lade, there have been rampant reports of frequent natural disasters, including fires and floods in Australia in recent years. What more can you tell us, and what do you believe is perhaps making Australia more prone to such calamities, if I may?
Australia's actually always experienced lots of natural disasters. Well, one of our famous poets, Dorothea McKellar, wrote about Australia as a land of droughts and flooding rains. As Professor Yoon indicated, climate change is unfortunately making these natural disasters that we've always experienced more frequent and more severe. For example, the wildfires that we had in early 2020 burnt a massive area, actually an area larger than the entire Korean peninsula. It destroyed over 3,000 buildings, killed 30 people, and is estimated to have killed over 3 billion animals. And then just 2 years later, we had devastating floods that killed 27 people and flooded nearly 30,000 homes. And just last week, we had some towns in southeastern Australia that incredibly had fires followed by floods on the very next day. The effects of climate change are also being compounded by the changes that have been made to our landscape over the last 2 centuries of European settlement. We've cleared a lot of vegetation, which makes floods more extreme. The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, who have been here since well before Europeans, regularly burnt the landscape, which made it less susceptible to large fires. What's happening now is that while these burns are still occurring, they are less frequent, which makes large areas of forests more vulnerable to large fires.
Right, I see. Professor Yoon, generally speaking then, climate change is believed to be rendering countries more vulnerable to natural disasters. All that being said then, how high are the risks for such events here in Korea?
Well, South Korea and also Australia, we are really well-developed countries, very well-resourced countries. But yet, we have natural resource disasters, and then the consequences. That's including human casualties. So compared to like 50 years ago or 30 years ago, we have a much more advanced infrastructures, technologies, and resources. But the one thing we need to know is all the regulation we set for like infrastructures was done in 50 or 30 years ago, meaning that, for example, like sewage systems, which handles the flow waters, that was the design back then. But then what happens with the climate change is that the amount of precipitation that happens within an hour is likely to increase. So meaning that in 50 years ago, we need this big sewage system. That's enough. But then right now, we are facing a new challenges because this bottom line is kind of slowly moving up. So that whatever happens in terms of floodings, that the chance to have a disaster is increasing as well.
Right, that sounds very grim. Meanwhile, Dr. Lade, then, what efforts are underway in Australia to better counter natural disasters?
So I think the fires and the floods of the last few years have woken us up to the fact that we're facing threats that by their size and by their frequency are much more severe than what we've seen before. So some things that Australia has done has been to set up a National Resilience Task Force, which has established a national disaster risk reduction framework to take a national approach to counter disasters, whereas approaches were previously at state or smaller scales. We've also established a National Emergency Management Agency to respond to emergencies, help communities recover, and also prepare Australia for future disasters. The State of New South Wales has established a Reconstruction Authority to fund disaster preparedness, recovery, reconstruction and adaptation. For example, supporting people to move out of areas that are highly vulnerable to floods. There's an increasing public awareness of the intensity of these disasters too. For example, some landowners who previously might have attempted to stay and fight off an incoming wildfire now recognise that some fires are just too intense to fight. We're getting these phenomena where wildfires generate their own weather systems, and it just becomes impossible for individuals to deal with. We also have research going on, such as at my university, that looks at providing better early warning systems and also the capacity to fight and put out wildfires very soon after their ignition before they get too big.
Right, good to know. And Professor Yoon, we've talked about how the risks also remain for South Korea with regard to natural disasters. And that being said, how prepared is Korea, including its public, to respond to natural disasters, do you think?
As I mentioned, that in terms of like infrastructures or technologies, I think we have a pretty good resources. But what we should do is we have to really rearrange those resources to better prepare those type of risk or the disasters. So for example, I know that the people in South Korea nowadays that receive the message warnings said that, okay, it's likely to have a flood, that we are going to have more rains. But then sometimes, because it's too many warnings and people just don't pay too much attention to it, and then what people just maybe tend to say that, oh, it's that happens, the warning happened in the past, but we are okay, so we don't need to worry about this time. So we have to find a way that categorize those risks, and then how we send out the warnings to the people that will be affected by those disasters. So, for example, like these summers in Korea, we have a kind of series of the heavy rain events, and then some people may say, "Oh, this happened yesterday, so we are not going to have another big rains tomorrow or today." And then they just ignore it, or they may just be busy with something else. But what we should do is, when the disasters or the risk is high enough, we in a way that force people just to be evacuated or not to go to certain areas. We have those technologies, just we haven't implemented those things yet, or we need to sort things out. Which one needs to be done first? Which one is high priority, less priority, and then how to categorize those things. So just to sum up, that I believe that we have certain technologies. We still need to have more, but we do have those. And what we have to do is we have to maximize utilizing those resources that we have right now.
Right, and setting our priorities straight, of course, and making sure that the public is well aware of the dangers that they may be exposed to as well. Dr. Lade, regarding the impact of climate change on natural disasters, what is its connection to earthquakes? Are these natural disasters occurring more frequently as well, or have they simply been receiving more media coverage, do you think?
That's a very interesting one, earthquakes and climate change. Earthquakes are, of course, caused by movement of the earth deep underground. So their relationship with climate change is certainly less direct than with the many other natural disasters that originate at the Earth's surface. But research has actually shown that, surprisingly, there is a link between earthquakes and climate change. For example, in the Himalayan mountains, many more earthquakes occur during the dry months than the wet months. And this is because the weight of all the extra water that's on the land during the wet season pushes down on the Earth's surface and stabilizes it. Then when the water dries up, the Earth rebounds and becomes relatively unstable and more vulnerable to earthquakes. Climate change is likely to make the monsoons more intense and therefore increase the strength of this depression and rebound, and therefore possibly the frequency and intensity of earthquakes. Similarly, melting glaciers around the world are releasing weight off the Earth's surface and causing the ground in those regions to rise and potentially become more unstable. This could also lead to more earthquakes in those regions. But in those parts of the world that don't have monsoons and don't have large glaciers, we would expect little relationship between climate change and earthquakes.
Right, I see. Professor Yoon, so we have a daunting task ahead with regard to taking action aimed at reducing disaster risk. That being said, and again, which earlier you mentioned about how South Korea needs to set its priorities straight and encourage its public to be more aware about the dangers of natural disasters, what other measures or more immediate measures do you suppose the government can take to better tackle this very sad reality?
I think before we talked about immediate actions, we can think about a long-term goals. The long-term goal is that we really have to tackle the climate change or global warming, so that we have to reduce the carbon emissions or the climate forcings back to, at least we have to control these warmings up to some degrees. So that's a long-term goal, and it cannot be done by Korea alone. It's an international effort, and we have to, but it cannot be done like 1 day or 2 days. It has to be, we have to target like a 2050 or 2060s to be more realistic, and we have to really achieve that. But then in the short terms is that the disaster is going to happen. That's the kind of given statement. So disaster is likely to happen. The next thing is how to prepare it. To prepare that, we have to have a more accurate prediction systems. That's like typhoons or the heavy rains and those things. We need to have those predictions. And then based on those predictions or even the very short-term forecasting, we have to send out the warnings, and then we just have to find a way to reduce human casualties and also economic damages. But priority has to go that the human casualty has to be reduced as much as possible. It's not like Australia's case, but South Korea, we do have fires when it comes to spring seasons, and then occasionally we have big fires along the East Coast. So that that happens, we have to really evacuate people as much as possible, as quickly as possible, and then we set the boundaries to control the fires. So just like that, we have to have a long-term missions or long-term goals or visions, and then in the short terms, the key priority has to be reducing human casualties, and I think that has to go along in a kind of 2 years to prepare these disasters.
Right, indeed. And broadly speaking, Dr. Lade, then, what do you propose to allow for an effective or resilient response to natural disasters?
I fully support Professor Yoon's response on this point. It's this classic combination that we always talk about in climate policy: adaptation on one hand and mitigation on the other. We need to acknowledge that we live in an increasingly dangerous new world, which means investing in disaster risk reduction, educating communities, developing early warning systems, funding our frontline responders, and building resilience to allow communities to recover from and adapt to disasters. But at the same time, we need to mitigate. We need to recognise that halting climate change will also stop the situation getting any worse than it is already. We need to stop emitting greenhouse gases through transforming our energy, transport, agricultural and economic systems. Down in Canberra here at the Australian National University, where I work, I mentioned before, there's research led by Professor Yibra to develop technology that will detect fire ignition as it's happening in remote forests and then deploy drones to extinguish the fires before they grow. That's a very exciting work. My own research focuses on how providing individuals and communities with lots of options to respond to disasters helps to build their resilience and reduce disaster risk. My research shows that it's dangerous to make response plans too precise and rigid and optimised to specific disasters, because we need that flexibility to adapt to the increasingly new and dangerous ways that disasters are behaving.
Right, indeed, of course. All right, then, Dr. Lade, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts today. And Professor Yoon, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
Great to be with you.
Right. Well, on that note, we end this week's editions of Issues and Insiders. Have a good weekend and see you same time next Monday.